In Washington. On the line from Beijing, China, we have with us Stephanie Klein-Albrecht, and she's with the International Crisis Group. Stephanie, thank you for joining us.
No problem.
Tell us now, we've got an issue regarding the South China Sea again, and this obviously is the conflict between China and the Philippines about a very important part of the South China Sea. Why is there such controversy over this area?
Well, the South China Sea is actually a very strategic body of water and uninhabited islands, which is sandwiched between and claimed by countries as diverse as China, Vietnam, the Philippines, Malaysia, and Brunei. The body of water is believed to contain abundant natural resources, and it's the home of one-third of the world's marine biodiversity. Furthermore, it's a very important world shipping lane. One-third of the world's shipping traffic passes through the sea. And for those reasons, it's a very important strategic and geopolitical area, and any conflict in the area would have not only drastic political implications, but also could bring major economic consequences for the world.
Now, to my understanding, China has now sent a third patrol vessel to this this boundary area, and it's now in its 10th day that this kind of testiness is going on, right?
That's correct. What's happened is China has actually recently retracted 2 of its vessels, and I think there's one more Chinese vessel remaining, which shows us that we're probably coming to the end of the standoff. But the standoff itself is significant because it does show that countries are using fishing disputes and fishing in disputed waters almost as a proxy for the larger sovereignty disputes between these countries. And the problem is that once you have a dispute like that, they get extremely difficult to de-escalate because what you have is strong nationalist sentiment in countries like the Philippines, Vietnam, and China, which makes it difficult for these countries to be seen as backing down or being weak in front of their own publics. And we've seen that, and we've also seen that there's a quasi-Coast Guard arms race going on in the region, which is contributing to actually more and more law enforcement vessels, which means that we're likely to see more of these types of skirmishes in the sea.
Now, to my understanding, most countries or international law says that the property or the boundary extends from any country 200 miles out. Now, does this include 200 miles for either China or the Philippines or anyone else?
Well, the problem right now with the South China Sea is that there are 2 issues. There's the sovereignty over the islands themselves, and after that, the UN Law of the Sea kicks in, where the islands to which a country has sovereignty generate an exclusive economic zone of 200 nautical miles. One of the problems right now in resolving the disputes is that China has put forward a 9-dashed line, and it's quite unclear to people whether that 9-dashed line, which is quite encompassing, includes territorial waters or just the islands that then create exclusive economic zones. So there's a lot of confusion over this. What's clear is that both the Philippines and China do claim Scarborough Shoal, and that's why the Chinese felt that they could go in and fish in that area.
Well, and we'll be clear about this. Scarborough Shoal is where the standoff began about 2 weeks ago, right?
Absolutely, absolutely. And it's far closer. It's only about 200 kilometers from the coast of Philippines. In fact, it's closer than that, and it's 3 times that distance to the Chinese coast. But China's 9-dash line actually does approach some of the coastlines of countries that I mentioned earlier, the 5 to 6 different countries that are claiming portions of the South China Sea.
And the shoal is where the Philippines were complaining that these Chinese fishermen were poaching in their territory, and that's how this whole thing started. I mean, the most recent.
Absolutely, absolutely. And the Philippines tried to arrest the Chinese fishermen, and then the Chinese sent in reinforcements to ensure that they weren't going to be arrested. It is worrying that it has taken 10 days to try and sort this problem out, because we can assume that the diplomats of both countries have been working on this 24 hours a day. And so it shows the dangers, really, of what are really not intentional incidents. Certainly, China and other countries are sending fishermen into disputed areas as a way of trying to show that this is part of their territory. But small incidents can easily lead to more escalated incidents or these full-blown political crises, and that's what's so worrying about the nature of skirmishes in the South China Sea.
Can you give us some idea of the types of deposits, natural resource deposits that are in this area?
Well, it's believed to contain a lot of gas and oil deposits. The problem is that the estimates are wildly divergent. The U.S. Geological Survey estimate, for example, is far lower than the estimate of the Chinese government. But it's difficult to know with any certainty simply because of the disputes. So whenever different countries try to go engage in surveys, they run into problems often by other countries that don't want to allow them to do that. For example, we saw last year an incident where a Chinese vessel cut the cable of a Vietnamese survey vessel. That was in May of 2011 that was trying to actually map the types of resources the sea might hold.
Well, I understand, too, that in Manila, the Philippine protesters were at the Chinese embassy protesting this latest incident, and they certainly want China to withdraw from that shoal. And there's 3 days of protest there. Are we going to see this kind of thing happening in the Philippines even more? I mean, obviously in China, you don't usually see that, but in the Philippines at least, will we see more protests there?
I think that it's quite likely. The Philippines, and we had the same incident last year in Vietnam following these incidents between China and the Vietnamese with regard to the cutting of the cables. You had Vietnamese on the streets in front of the Chinese embassy. And what it does is it makes it very difficult. It boxes in these governments, in fact, so that they can't step away. They can't be seen as weak. And part of the problem is that they themselves have created historical narratives whereby they claim these areas. And so the public rallies around that. And then if it comes to actually a negotiation over sovereignty, obviously everyone has to be willing to compromise. That's the nature of these negotiations. But when you have a very heated domestic political environment and nationalist public opinion to that extent, obviously it's very difficult to do that. You have to engage in very delicate messaging in order to convince the people that this is the best thing. But obviously the tensions right now in the sea are very high. And the Philippines, for example, call the sea the West Philippine Sea. The Chinese call it the South China Sea. The Vietnamese have called it the East Vietnamese Sea. So, you do see all of these different, all the different claims. And, the Spratlys, for example, are claimed by most of all of those claimants. So there's overlapping claims sometimes. It's not bilateral. It gets into 3, 4, and 5 claimants claiming the same parts of the same territories.
Well, there's some other countries here, too. You mentioned Vietnam. There's Brunei, Malaysia, and Taiwan. Have there been other skirmishes with, say, Malaysia, Taiwan, Vietnam?
There have been some, but because Malaysia and Brunei are so far south, the boats don't get there as often as they do, as we've seen with regard to Vietnam and the Philippines.
So where does this actually, where do these disputes actually go? I mean, where does one nation take their dispute to? I mean, the United Nations is one, but is there any maritime authority?
Well, I mean, what you could take advantage of are the dispute resolution mechanisms under the United Nations, because, there are two issues here. One is the sovereignty of the land features, which would then engage UNCLOS after those are decided. Arbitration would be one option. The problem is that China is not very keen to engage in arbitration because it fears that these institutions are mostly Western institutions and might be prone to issuing a decision that would force China to compromise in front of its people. China is going through an important transition right now. Frankly, China's energy is focused very much on the domestic situation, on maintaining this breakneck economic growth, on maintaining political and social stability. So I don't think that it's something that the Chinese are looking to absolutely resolve in the short term.
Well, when we take a look at this issue, and obviously with China's exploding economy, obviously it's in their interest to stake out as much territory as possible to get these natural resources, especially gas and oil, right?
Well, as a matter of fact, the Chinese are not out there engaging so much in trying to exploit these natural resources for the moment. That could change because they recognize that these are very tricky political issues. The oil companies frankly, have a lot of other options around the world. They're obviously very present in the Middle East, in Africa and Latin America, and it does cost roughly 5 to 7 times as much to bring resources out of deep sea water than it does to do it on land. So for the moment, Chinese companies have been not so aggressive. The problem is that Vietnam, Malaysia, and the Philippines economies, they're going to be forced to start to pull some of these resources out of the oceans more quickly because they obviously have a weaker economic situation than China, and they do rely on the seas for not only oil but also fishing. And on that note, Vietnam is being forced to fish further and further out because of overfishing and pollution. So, we're going to see these economies that actually, for their own economic reasons, require the sea. We're going to see that, being seen by China as a provocation, and then we might see further clashes.
All right, Stephanie Klein.